1982. Tokyo's Kabukicho district, the neon capital of Japan's underworld. A Korean gang leader named Kim Hee-ro walks into a Yakuza-owned nightclub with 12 men. They're not there to negotiate. What happens next triggers the most violent gang war in Japanese history. A conflict so brutal that the Japanese government declares martial law in parts of Tokyo. But here's what almost nobody knows. This wasn't just a gang war. This was the climax of a 30-year shadow conflict between Korean immigrants and Japan's most powerful crime syndicate. A war that started in the ruins of World War II. A war rooted in discrimination, survival, and revenge. A war fought in complete secrecy while the world looked the other way. This is the story of how Korean gangs infiltrated Japan's underworld, challenged the Yakuza's absolute power, and changed organized crime in Asia forever. This is Korea's revenge. To understand this conflict, you need to understand who the Zainichi Koreans were. Between 1910 and 1945, Korea was under Japanese colonial rule. Japan occupied the Korean peninsula, forcing millions of Koreans to relocate to Japan as laborers, working in mines, factories, and construction projects under brutal conditions. By 1945, when World War II ended and Japan surrendered, there were over 2 million Koreans living in Japan. Most wanted to go home. But the Korean peninsula had been divided into North and South. A civil war was brewing. Many Koreans in Japan had nowhere to return to. Their homes had been destroyed, their families scattered. So they stayed in Japan. They became known as the Zainichi, which literally means staying in Japan. But post-war Japan didn't welcome them. Zainichi Koreans were denied Japanese citizenship. They couldn't vote. They faced systematic discrimination in employment, housing, and education. Many Japanese landlords refused to rent to Koreans. Most companies wouldn't hire them. Entire Korean communities were pushed into slums on the outskirts of Japanese cities, places like Akuno in Osaka and Shinjuku in Tokyo. These weren't just poor neighborhoods. They were ghettos. Forgotten zones where Japanese police rarely patrolled and Japanese society pretended didn't exist. And in that vacuum, in those forgotten places, organized crime took root. Because when society shuts you out, you build your own society. And for thousands of young Zainichi Korean men in the 1950s and 60s, that society was the underworld. Here's the paradox. To survive in Japan's underworld, Korean gangs had to join the very organization that represented everything Japanese, the Yakuza. The Yakuza, Japan's traditional organized crime syndicates, had existed for centuries. They controlled gambling, prostitution, protection rackets, and the black market across Japan. They were deeply rooted in Japanese culture, with rituals, hierarchies, and codes of honor. And they were almost entirely Japanese. But the Yakuza had a problem. After World War II, they needed manpower. The war had devastated Japan, and the Yakuza syndicates were rebuilding just like everyone else. Korean immigrants, young, desperate, willing to do anything to survive, were a perfect recruitment pool. So in the 1950s, Yakuza syndicates began recruiting Zainichi Koreans. At first, Koreans were given the lowest positions: street-level enforcers, debt collectors, muscle. The dirty work that Japanese Yakuza members didn't want to do. But some Koreans were ambitious. They were smart, ruthless, and hungry for power. One of them was a man named Hisayuki Machi. Machi was born in Korea but raised in Japan. In the 1950s, he joined a Yakuza syndicate in Tokyo. Within a decade, he'd risen through the ranks to become one of the most powerful Yakuza bosses in Japan, despite being Korean. Machi did something unprecedented. He created the Tosei Kai, a Yakuza organization that was majority Korean. Officially, they were Yakuza. They followed the codes, wore the suits, performed the rituals. But beneath the surface, they were Korean. They spoke Korean in private. They protected Korean communities. They recruited Korean members. Machi had built a Trojan horse inside the Yakuza, and he wasn't alone. Across Japan, in Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, Fukuoka, Korean gang leaders were doing the same thing, joining Yakuza syndicates, rising through the ranks, and quietly building Korean power bases inside Japanese organizations. By the 1970s, some estimates suggest that 30 to 40% of Yakuza members were ethnically Korean. The Yakuza didn't realize it yet, but they'd been infiltrated. Korean Yakuza members operated with a dual identity. In public, they were Japanese. Many adopted Japanese names, a practice called tsume. They learned perfect Japanese. They bowed, followed etiquette, and embraced Yakuza traditions. But in private, they remained Korean. They maintained connections to Korean communities. They sent money back to families in Korea, and most importantly, they stayed loyal to each other. This created an invisible network inside the Yakuza, a shadow organization within the organization. Korean Yakuza members would help each other rise through the ranks. They'd share intelligence, protect each other during internal conflicts, and gradually, they began taking control of lucrative territories and operations. In Osaka, Korean gangs controlled much of the city's entertainment district. In Tokyo, they dominated certain gambling operations. In Kobe, they ran the ports, critical for smuggling operations. The Japanese Yakuza leadership started to notice, and they didn't like it. Tensions began to simmer. Japanese Yakuza members resented the Koreans' growing power. They saw them as outsiders, foreigners who didn't truly belong in a Japanese institution. Racist slurs became common. Chosenjin, a derogatory term for Koreans, was thrown around openly. Korean members were excluded from certain decisions, passed over for promotions despite their contributions. The discrimination that Koreans had fled by joining the Yakuza was now following them inside the organization. By the late 1970s, the question wasn't if the alliance would break, it was when. And the answer came in 1981 in the city of Osaka, when a Korean Yakuza underboss named Kim Hee-ro made a decision that would change everything. He decided he was done pretending to be Japanese. Kim Hee-ro was everything the Yakuza feared. He was Korean, but he'd risen to become underboss of a major Yakuza-affiliated organization in Osaka. He controlled nightclubs, gambling dens, and protection rackets across the city. He was wealthy, connected, and powerful, but he was angry. In 1981, a dispute erupted between Kim's crew and a traditional Japanese Yakuza faction. The details are murky. Some say it was over territory, others say it was about a woman, others claim it was about unpaid debts. But the real issue was deeper. The Japanese faction wanted Kim gone. They wanted Koreans pushed back down to the lower ranks. They wanted the old hierarchy restored. Kim refused. On a December night in 1981, 3 of Kim's men were ambushed outside an Osaka nightclub. 2 were killed. 1 survived and reported back to Kim. The message was clear: back down or die. Kim Hee-ro didn't back down. 2 weeks later, Kim walked into the office of the Japanese Yakuza boss who'd ordered the hit. He brought 12 Korean enforcers with him. What happened in that room has never been fully confirmed. No official police report exists. No arrests were made. but witnesses outside the building reported hearing gunshots, screaming, and then silence. When Kim and his men walked out an hour later, the Japanese Yakuza boss and 4 of his lieutenants were dead. Kim had just declared war on the Yakuza. Not a faction, not a rival gang. The entire Japanese Yakuza establishment. And this time, the Koreans weren't going to hide. They weren't going to use Japanese names. They weren't going to pretend anymore. This was open conflict. What followed was one of the most violent gang wars in Japanese history. Between 1982 and 1985, the conflict between Korean gangs and traditional Yakuza syndicates turned Japan's underworld into a war zone. In Osaka, Kobe, and Tokyo, shootings became almost daily occurrences. Nightclubs were firebombed, cars exploded, bodies were found in rivers, alleys, and construction sites. The violence was public and terrifying. In 1983, a shootout in Osaka's Minami district left 7 people dead in broad daylight, including 2 civilians caught in the crossfire. The Japanese government panicked. Police launched massive crackdowns. Thousands of Yakuza members, both Japanese and Korean, were arrested. But the war continued. Because this wasn't just about crime, this was about identity, respect, and decades of resentment boiling over. Korean gangs fought with a ferocity that shocked even the Yakuza. They had nothing to lose. Many had been discriminated against their entire lives by Japanese society, and now by the very criminal organization they'd helped build. The Yakuza, for all their power, weren't prepared for an internal rebellion of this scale. Some Japanese Yakuza leaders tried to negotiate. They offered truces, territorial concessions, even shared leadership structures. But Kim Hee-ro and other Korean leaders refused. They didn't want a seat at the table, they wanted their own table. By 1985, the war had reached a stalemate. Hundreds were dead, thousands were in prison. Both sides were bleeding resources and manpower. And then something unexpected happened. The Korean gangs started winning. Not militarily, but strategically. They controlled key territories. They had international connections to Korea, to China, to emerging criminal networks across Asia. They were younger, more adaptable, more willing to embrace new criminal enterprises like drug trafficking and human smuggling. The traditional Yakuza, bound by old codes and hierarchies, couldn't keep up. By the late 1980s, a quiet understanding emerged. The Koreans weren't going anywhere. They were a permanent fixture of Japan's underworld. The Yakuza had been forced to share power, not out of generosity, but out of necessity. So, who won the war? The answer is complicated. Officially, the violence ended in the mid-1980s. Police crackdowns, arrests, and internal negotiations led to an uneasy peace. But the underworld had fundamentally changed. Korean gangs had earned their place. Today, some estimates suggest that nearly 30% of Yakuza members are still ethnically Korean, despite making up less than 1% of Japan's total population. Some of Japan's most powerful modern Yakuza syndicates have Korean leadership or significant Korean membership. The old barriers are gone, but the cost was enormous. Hundreds died in the conflict. Thousands were imprisoned. Entire communities, both Japanese and Korean, were traumatized by the violence. Kim Hee-ro, the man who started the rebellion, disappeared in 1987. Some say he was assassinated by rival Yakuza factions. Others claim he fled to South Korea and lived under a new identity. A few believe he's still alive, living quietly in Osaka. The truth? No one really knows. What we do know is this: the Korean infiltration of the Yakuza wasn't just a criminal story. It was a story about immigration, discrimination, and survival. Zainichi Koreans in post-war Japan faced impossible choices. Locked out of mainstream society, they built power in the only place that would have them, the underworld. And when that underworld tried to push them back down, they fought back. Today, Japan's relationship with its Korean population remains complicated. Discrimination still exists. Zainichi Koreans still face challenges. But the days when Koreans had to hide their identity, even in the criminal world, are over. The Yakuza learned a hard lesson. You can't build an empire on the backs of people you refuse to respect. Eventually, they'll take that empire from you. And sometimes, they'll do it from the inside. This was the untold story of how Korean gangs infiltrated Japan, and why the Yakuza will never be the same. If you want more stories like this, subscribe to Shadow Seoul. Next week, we're covering the Kakangpai, Korea's original organized crime families, and how they ruled Korea before democracy came. Which Korean crime story should we investigate next? Drop your suggestions in the comments. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the shadows.